Good evening, I'm Jo Pye and I live in southeast London. Today is a bit of a groundhog day for me. It's the 31st of December 2020 and it's an end of an era in my life that I have cherished. I know I'm not alone in this, there are hundreds of us feeling exactly the same way. And I'd like to share my little life story, my little journey, being a European. I've always known I was European from the moment I was born, really. I'm the daughter of an Italian mother and an English father. So I've always known that I've had a foot in two different camps. And I was born, as I said, in 1953. And perhaps it's useful if I just go back over my parents, how they met, because it's actually so important to the whole story of how the UK has merged into Europe and how my life has been entwined in Europe. My mother is Italian and she was an announcer on Italian radio. She was the voice of Free Italy. She was the voice that the partisans listened to under the bedclothes and it was Italia combatte. And as the Allies were making their way up the peninsula, her voice would be the one that would be telling them in code where the Allies were going to spring next. My father was a sergeant in the British military police. And at one point in 1945, after the end of the war, the British authorities thought it would be a jolly good idea if the British Army fraternised with the worthy anti-fascists that were still knocking around in Rome. And they set up something called a tea dance. Now, the British officers were rather snooty about it and didn't really fancy that. So they harangued their sergeants into going to this tea dance with these worthies. Now, my father loved ballroom dancing. So he thought, okay, I'm going. And he went along and as soon as he arrived at the tea dance, he looked at my mother and said, Christ, I've seen a virgin. This is important because my father had been working in the military police, in the vice squad, and he'd met all sorts of absolutely fabulous women in Greece and in Italy, women that had to do all sorts of things to keep their families fed, and he had enormous respect for women. Anyway, he was absolutely smitten with my mother. And armed with just a Hugo's phrase book, they set off in a romance. And in 1946, they decided to marry in Rome. Now, at that point, my mother was still being threatened because she was fraternising with an ally. She was being threatened with having her hair shaved off and being beaten up. Luckily, that didn't happen. And they got married in 1946 and she caught the first freighter leaving Ostia for London. And she arrived in London sort of June 1946 and took herself straight off to the BBC. When she was a journalist in Rome, she worked with a lot of Jewish journalists who had had to escape, and they said, Mariuccia, if you ever come to England, look us up, you'll be able to find us. We will be in the world service of the BBC. My mother never thought she'd end up in England. But anyway, the first thing she does when she arrives is she goes to BBC, and lo and behold, there they are. And she immediately becomes an editor and a broadcaster. And latterly, she became the studentessa, the student in Parliamo Italiano, which was part of the British Council and the BBC's tutorials for teaching people, Italian and French and German, whatever. So she was in the Italian section of the BBC, where she stayed for many years. On the strength of the Parliamo Italiano, which was a sort of a primer in Italian, she became a teacher in adult education. Now, quite interesting, there were a lot of people who wanted to learn Italian in the late 50s and early 60s. A lot of people had liked opera, but also she had an awful lot of soldiers who had actually thoroughly enjoyed their war in Italy, loved the food, loved the people, and wanted to go back and speak Italian. So she did that for a number of years. She also became a courier for the Compagnia Italiana del Turismo, which was CIT. As I said, I was born in 1953, and I went to a primary school in Plumstead, and my sister and I were the only two children that spoke another language. That school now has over 120 different languages being spoken, so that basically says quite a lot about how things have changed. So it wasn't all pleasant, because the war had only been over 15 to 20 years. So we were called spaghetti ears, we were called dirty eye ties, although we actually had a B-day, which I thought was quite novel. Nobody else had one, but we did. Dirty eye ties, cowards, which wasn't particularly nice. It didn't help also that my parents' the first house they bought, was next door to a couple where the wife had lost her brother in the North African campaign to Italians. So unfortunately, she did suffer physically, emotionally, and mentally as a result of living next door to them. So my sister and I grew up bilingual, and so many people said to my mum, "Why are you teaching them that language?" To which she would reply, "Well, 55 million other people speak Italian, so why not? I also want them to know about Italy and going to Italy. It's my country." So there we were at school, my sister and I. We had an Italian mum. We spoke a different language or a second language. We ate different foods where my mum could get up to Soho to get them. And we had something else. We had holidays in Europe, in Italy, this far off place. Most of our contemporaries went to Dymchurch or Margate, if they went anywhere. But we would go for 3 months to Italy and spend the summers there as my mother did her courier work. Now, it struck me as I was preparing for this just how important that those experiences were for me, because we'd be on the beach all day, every day in Lignano Sabbiadoro, which is on the Adriatic near Venice. And on the beach, there were Germans, Austrians, Dutch, French, Yugoslavs. And we didn't have a language between us, but we had laughter, we had games, we taught each other games, we taught each other singing games that we had, as I say, we had nothing between us except fun and childish innocence. Now, it struck me how those parents of the children must have felt, thinking only 15 years previously, we were at war. The Germans, the French, the Dutch, the Brits, we were at war with one another. How did they feel watching us playing? They must have felt, I hope, well, go, let us play, that this was a beautiful bonus that they might never have expected. So that sort of puts my childhood into sort of an episode. Then we joined the common market, and that was absolutely brilliant because I became a European. And it was really quite nice that, you know, I could have a foot in both camps and not be odd, not be considered odd. And I started to enjoy being able to go to Italy without having to surrender my passport to the questura, to the police, and get it back the next day, as they counted us in and they counted us out. So the 60s moved into the 70s and into the 80s. And we still had fear of the nuclear war, and we still had the Iron Curtain. And I had my first child, and I've joined something called the National Childbirth Trust. And we started to get Hungarians, Poles, and East Germans. And it was so good to meet the enemy and know that they were exactly like us, and how good that was. And so, of course, they soon joined the European Economic Zone. And you can just imagine how I feel, or how I felt, being able to get in my car and drive all the way across Europe, only showing my passport once when I left over. This is one of the things that I am going to find so difficult, to lose that feeling that we Europeans, we share values, we share the land, the geography, we share ideals. And for me, with my background, to feel it wasn't just close Europe, but we could go almost up to Russia and still be in Europe. And that for me has been so important. And to lose that is one of the things that I am finding most difficult. To lose that sort of idea of belonging. I'm quite honestly, we went to Bruges on the 31st of January this year, my husband and I, because we really didn't want to stay in England for the festivities of leaving the European Union. And I already felt a stranger, somebody who really shouldn't be there, sort of almost like a leper. I know it was, nobody treated me badly. I just began to feel, I'm going back to, this is Groundhog Day, I'm going back to what I used to feel before, not really belonging to Europe, but feeling that I belong to Europe. This year, Andy and I were going to be moving to Italy to live in our beautiful home that we've built up there over a number of years. Well, no EHICs, no, you know, that's not going to happen. So those plans have been put on hold indefinitely. But like many other people, lots of us are in that same boat. And I'm not sure how I'm going to feel when I set off to Italy next time, how exactly I'm going to feel when I'm sitting on the beach in Italy and looking out over the mountains, whether I'll feel the same kinship or whether I'll feel odd. But I think there are people who are going to suffer an awful lot more as a result. I'm an old lady now, so, you know, it's not important. What is important is that our young people have been robbed of a future that a lot of us have enjoyed. And to take us out of Erasmus, to not even be part of Erasmus, is absolutely mean, despicable, and is the purpose that the government doesn't want our youngsters to know how good it is to live in a united Europe? Is that the purpose of it? So we've got our young people being robbed. I've got my wonderful EU27 neighbours and friends who are facing being asked already, why are you still here? Why haven't you moved away? It is just absolutely crucifying to feel that and to think that how quickly the genie's been let out of the bottle and the nastiness has come. On the plus side, of course, there are millions of us who actually do like being Europeans and they want to stay Europeans. And a lot of us are joining the European movement, March for Change, Volt Europa, the New Europeans. The new thing coming up is something called the rejoinregister.org. Now that is something where we're going to gather people's names that aren't going to get lost on government databases with petitions and things like this. We're going to gather people's names so that we can have millions, we can show that millions of people have pledged to rejoin. You don't have to pledge with money, it's pledging your name. So that's going to be starting tonight. It'll be online tonight and for good and all. So do join if you feel that Europe is worth hanging on to, and our place in Europe and our feelings for Europe and our emotions and our friends in Europe who want us back. But we've got to do so much now to rebuild. And although it's Groundhog Day for me, I'm one of the millions that actually want to do something good and positive and get us back into Europe as soon as possible. We're going to have to change the way we vote. We're going to have to change an awful number of things, make our society much more worthy of getting back into Europe. But I'm still European. I'm forever European. And I really, really hope that you feel the same as me, and that when our tears dry after 11 o'clock tonight, we will recharge our batteries and say, this is worth it. I am European and I'm not going to surrender that and go back to some sort of warfare when we have peace and we can build on the peace. So good night to everybody out there. I sincerely hope that we can dry our tears and get back out there. We deserve it. We're worth it. And I really think that Europe can benefit from having good Brits back again. So good night. Tanti saluti e buonanotte e buon anno.